All right, we can start now. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this meeting of IPAN members, affiliates and supporters to discuss IPAN's proposed vision for an alternative defence policy for an independent Australia. And we really want to hear your views and your comments. So my name is Shirley Winton. Some of you already know me, member of IPAN National Coordinating Committee and member of the Alternative Sovereign Self-Defence Working Group. I'm in Melbourne on the unceded country of the Wurundjeri people, Kulin Nation. And on behalf of IPAN, I pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We stand in solidarity with the First Nations people's struggles for justice, for sovereignty and self-determination. Always was Aboriginal land. Could people please mute yourselves? From the time of European colonisation of Australia and the dispossession of the First Nations people, Australia's foreign and defence policies have mostly been subservient to the two main big imperial powers, first the British and now the US. This subservience to big powers is a colonial legacy of this country, that Australian people are dependent on major foreign powers. And this is reinforced by falsely spread belief that Australian people cannot defend themselves, but need the protection of superior foreign powers. These colonial origins and false narrative have shaped Australia as a dependency, not capable of independence and sovereign self-defence, always beholden to big powers. However, the main beneficiaries of this dependency and falsehood beliefs and policies were and are in the main for big imperial powers and their interests. Today, more public concerns are raised at the incredibly rapid US militarisation of Australia and the region, the deep integration of Australia's defence forces into the US military apparatus, the loss of Australia's sovereignty, and unquestioningly following the US into another of its devastating wars of aggression, from Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and now China. Questions and concerns are more frequently raised about government decisions that enmesh Australia in the US military industrial complex, and that these policies and decisions do not serve the interests of peace and security of the Australian people and the region, but uphold the so-called US global rules-based order. Alternative sovereign self-defence is inseparable from an independent foreign policy. They must safeguard Australia's independence, build peace and security for the people of Australia and the region. We are confident that generally sovereign self-defence policies will ensure that the Australian people have the tools and capacity to build independent self-defence capabilities and no longer be beholden to or subservient to any big power. So we hope that this proposed vision for an alternative sovereign self-defence policy for an independent Australia will generate more widely public conversation about sovereign self-defence, peace in the region, and Australia's place in the world. And finally, as I think most people are aware, that there is no peace without justice. So we can start now with our first speaker. The first speaker is Bevan Ramsden, and Bevan will briefly outline the working group's proposal for a vision for an alternative self-defence policy for an independent Australia. His talk will be followed by Richard Tanter, Kathryn Kelly and Alison Broinowski. After the speakers, there will be 15 minutes for questions to speakers, followed by 20 minutes comments from participants. Bevan Ramsden, we'll start with Bevan. Bevan Ramsden is a former telecommunications engineer and TAFE teacher, an active member of New South Wales Teachers Federation. He's also a former member of IPAN's Coordinating Committee and currently editor of IPAN's monthly publication, The Voice. He has over a long period of time been an advocate for Australia's independence, and Bevan has made a significant contribution to IPAN and the movement for an independent Australia. It's over to you, Bevan.
Thank you, Shirley, for your introduction. Excuse me. I'm speaking from the land and the unceded territory of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to their culture and elders, past and present. In introducing this vision of an alternative defence policy, it might be helpful to put its development in context. 2.5 years ago, there was discussion within IPAN of the need to develop and support a self-defence policy for an independent Australia. It was felt that IPAN's credibility was at stake as we were questioning and are questioning the need for US bases and advocating an independent foreign policy, which means independent of the United States. Without an alternative, we could be seen as supporting a defenceless Australia. Members of IPAN then produced discussion papers on alternatives, including the concept of armed neutrality. A working group was formed to promote further discussion, and over the last 2 years, 4 webinars have been held exploring this theme of an alternative defence. These well-attended webinars included speakers who were formerly members of the ADF, Major General Michael Smith, Cameron Leckie, a former officer in the ADF, a military historian, Dr. Albert Palazzo, a war historian, Sue Rosen, former Australian diplomats, Dr. Alison Broinowski and John Lander, Dr. Sue Wareham from the Medical Association for Prevention of War, Dr. Emma Shortis, writer on the US Alliance, Joe Valentine, peace activist and member of the Quakers, and Dr. Mike Gilligan, who worked for 20 years in defence in policy evaluating military proposals for development. So there's been interaction and input from outside IPAN, and the end product, this vision, is the result of quite extensive discussion. We in the IPAN working group believe it embodies the principles that are fundamental to IPAN, and we are seeking your response tonight and your support for it. Can I say at the outset that this is not a vision that could be implemented under the present political conditions. Only when Australia has gained a substantial degree of independence and able to implement that could this vision become appropriate and find traction. So that we all know what we're talking about, perhaps we could put it up on the shared screen. Is that possible?
It's on the screen, Bevan. It's been shared screen.
The vision is prefaced, as you see, by an appropriate reference to First Nations peoples. Please note that this vision emphasises, first of all, that diplomacy and the building of positive relations with other countries is the first line of defence. Much greater effort and resources than are at present provided are needed to be put into this first line of defence. Military defence must always be secondary to diplomacy and a last resort when diplomatic efforts break down. Armed neutrality may be a new concept to some of us. It is the basis of Swiss defence. It was explored and developed by an Australian, David Martin, in the 1980s in his book, Armed Neutrality for Australia. He was assisted in writing that book by one of the speakers tonight, Richard Tanter. Sam Roggeveen of the Lowy Institute has elucidated a similar theme in his recent book, The Echidna Strategy. Armed neutrality means keeping out of wars between other countries and not allowing one's own territory, to be used in such wars. It also means reconfiguring and restructuring the ADF to operate only on our territory to defend against hostilities directed at our territory and its approach waters out to the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. This would be a solely Australian defensive operation without dependence on any foreign power. The vision acknowledges the need for a sovereign Australian manufacturing and industrial base to provide self-reliant support to the ADF and the development of all essential services and critical supply chains. I want to point out that it's not an isolationist policy and envisages ADF support where appropriate to United Nations peacekeeping forces, and that Australia would cultivate positive relationships with other non-aligned countries, particularly those in our region, with the aim of promoting peace and inter-country relations based on equality and mutual benefit. I think that's enough. I commend this vision for your consideration and support.
Thank you, Bevan. Participants at this Zoom will be invited to vote on this vision at the end of the meeting. So our next speaker is Richard Tanter, and Richard is a senior research associate with the Nautilus Institute. I'm just jumping a few things. And an honorary professor in the School of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He's a former president of the Australian board of ICAN, that's International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and is currently working on Australian intelligence, nuclear weapons, and foreign policy. Thank you, Richard. It's over to you.
Shirley, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Bunurong people in South Gippsland, and looking out on this really lovely landscape. And there's always this extraordinary contradiction between what we talk about and the reality of the land that would be burned, quite literally, if the worst of our fears comes to pass. So it's absolutely central to what we do, to acknowledge Aboriginal sovereignty in this land. And I'm very grateful to the IPAN Working Group for the way they have framed their declaration about that. Okay, I'll start I'm going to be really just introducing this topic, and in certain respects, Bevan's already covered some of the things I'm going to be saying. But I think it's worth unpacking a couple of things here. Let me just get this nice and big in the screen, and slideshow goes there, I think. All right. Okay. I'm going to be talking, as I suspect other people will, about the work of David Martin. And Bevan, thank you for your kind note about that very small role I had with David a very long time ago about this. I think that the issues that we are dealing with were really first dealt with in any length by David. And I think that what he is talking about is really at the core of what we want to say. And a few things we've touched on even already in the introduction. Let me just read you part of the first 2 pages of what David was saying, because it's an argument written by a novelist and a poet that says some of these things, not in fancy words, in fact, very plain words, but very directly. A healthy nation, confident in itself, manages its affairs in conformity with its long-term interests. It will fashion policies to ensure its survival as a free, prosperous, and peaceable community, taking account of its physical location and the quality and quantity of its human and material resources. It will also respect the legitimate aspirations of other nations. This book aims to show that the best policy for Australia is armed neutrality. It accords with our needs and with our geographical position. Shaped to our means, it would be both viable morally and in practice. It would let us establish stable and mutually beneficial relations with other countries, especially our neighbours. In the words of Thomas Jefferson during his first inaugural address, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. If we can let go, Martin said, if we can let go of the inherited belief that to be safe we need powerful protectors, we shall discover that we are quite able to look after ourselves. This would make us more enterprising and less self-enclosed, because independence promotes not truculence, but growth. We are tied to an alliance which, whatever purpose it once served or was supposed to serve, does not help us now and cannot be shaped to do so. It cannot make us secure against such dangers as we may one day have to meet, while it needlessly exposes us to other dangers, including nuclear war. Armed neutrality is not a prescription to cure all troubles. It's no rigid formula to guarantee us inviolable. No policy can do that. But to sustain it, we have enviable advantages, above all, strategic and economic ones. We can support it without having to Prussianize our society, without social regression, and without lowering our living standards. For this country, David finished by saying, armed neutrality is still a new idea. Therefore, in discussing it, one must distinguish the central and lasting from the narrowly topical. It will not come today or tomorrow, but it offers Australia a concrete and positive alternative to its present course. I've taken a bit of my time to set out that, because he was writing that in 1984, a very different time from now and a very dark time. I guess in certain respects it's even darker now, but it was very bleak at that time. And almost everything he emphasizes there is still true. This is something that Australia is deeply resistant to. I think we need to think not simply about foreign influence, but we need to think very seriously and carefully about where Australia fits in the global pattern of imperialism. And this is really not straightforward. It's, I think, quite complicated. I think what we've seen in the front pages of the Channel 9 newspapers about the behaviour of a senior public servant is not simply a matter of violating Australian norms, but I think tells us something about the depth of penetration of our political culture by our integration, our deepening integration, even more than when David wrote that, into the very complicated picture of American imperialism, which is not a simple or straightforward matter. What was David talking about? First of all, neutrality is sympathetic to non-alignment, but it's not the same thing. Non-alignment, which is formalizing in the non-aligned group of some 77 countries or so now, that's a foreign policy goal at best, sometimes honestly pursued, sometimes not, but it's a political concept. Neutrality is a very different idea. It refers to a situation in relation to actual armed conflict between states. It can be temporary, as in a state saying we are not going to participate in this particular armed conflict, or it can be permanent. And there are a number of permanent neutrals I'll talk about in a minute. None of them are very perfect. And in fact, I think the concept of neutrality is become a much more difficult one since David was talking about in those days. According to the Hague Conventions, that sort of period in European history before the worst of the European wars, starting in 1914, but after a really terrible time in the 19th century, two of the Hague Conventions in 1907 set out the obligations, really just codifying what was already happening in international law. If you want to be regarded as a neutral, to claim the right not to be invaded, then you must follow three primary rules. There must be no involvement in an armed conflict between states. Other people's wars, you stay out of them. You do not give assistance to the warring parties. And if you have trade or economic or financial or social relationships or legal relationships with other countries, then they must be provided on the basis of equal treatment for all belligerents. David Martin translated those ideas in summary form into 4 parts. First, no bases, no alliances in peacetime. We do not belong to a military alliance. We do not allow foreign bases on Australian soil. There could not be a clearer form of assistance to a country in the event of war. Australia must not accept, and this becomes quite tricky, but not impossible to negotiate, in peacetime, obligations, whether they're economic, political, ideological, or military, which would impair its neutrality in wartime. And of course, in Europe, that's been a big difficulty, firstly, with the advent of the United Nations. For example, Switzerland, a permanent neutral, did not join the United Nations until about 20 years ago. And also with the European Union, particularly with the advent of the European strategic foreign policy concept and defence policy concepts. What David was stressing, and this is why I think he was received with such great interest by the more thoughtful members of the early 1980s defence and strategic studies community in Canberra. He was reminding people that under the law, the Hague Conventions, a country is obliged to defend its neutrality. A neutrality where you accept another country walking in to take you over is no neutrality at all. That becomes effectively assistance to a belligerent. So in other words, the question of exactly what policy you actually want to have, strategic policy, industrial policy for defence manufacturers, your actual foreign policy is very closely related to what you need to do to maintain your claim to neutrality. Here's a rough list, arguable in some cases, of neutral states under international law today. The claim to neutrality is different in certain places. In the case of Austria, for example, it arises from the Cold War settlement in 1955 between the occupying powers after the Second World War. In the case of Costa Rica, it comes from a declaration in the constitution to be a demilitarized country. In the case of Mongolia, which is a country to which I have enormous affection for what it's done in the face of great difficulty between Russia and China, it's a declaration of permanent neutrality. There are other nonsense countries like the Vatican City that I won't talk about, but there are some large countries here, and there are some important ones here. And in Australia, we can't cope with non-alignment. We have no idea what it means to Indonesians, particularly Indonesians in their foreign policy and defence policy communities, to be a non-aligned country, and they mean it very seriously. And I've certainly seen Australian defence audiences where Australian military people, addressed by senior Indonesian diplomats, are kind of shocked by these people. I thought they were on our side. Well, they probably are actually, but they take non-alignment. That's not neither in one side nor the other in foreign policy terms pretty seriously. But we then have a harder idea of thinking, oh my God, there are quite large countries like Mexico, which are at least legally neutral. We have enormous blind spot, this deep cultural blind spot, which comes from essentially the complicated structure of imperialism towards the United Kingdom and, of course, then to the United States. If a country doesn't speak English, we don't pay any attention to it. If a country we don't pay any attention really to Germany or France, large capitalist countries like our own, but we ignore it. And we certainly don't think about what a country like Austria or Mexico or Switzerland really think. That's just not on our agenda. What's really important to understand, however, is that when David Martin wrote that book in 1984, he was primarily thinking about the European 5 neutrals, Austria, Finland, Ireland, Sweden, and Switzerland. They each came to their neutrality in quite different ways. Austria as the price of the Soviet Union moving out of occupied Austria. Finland, very obviously, because of the consequences of the Second World War and its neighbourhood with the Soviet Union. Ireland, because of England, deeply fraught there. Switzerland is the most obviously geographically defined neutral. It makes lots of sense in certain respects. However, we know that Finland and Sweden have abandoned neutrality. Firstly, Sweden talked about solidarity, and then it moved to abandoning neutrality. And both countries have applied to enter NATO, and there's no reason to think that they won't. Ireland has been rather, I was going to say Australian about this. Really, they have had a bob each way. They've allowed the Americans, particularly the US Air Force, throughout the Cold War, quite serious access to Ireland. Perhaps not so much now. Switzerland is now leaning very heavily away from neutrality as its touchstone. They've always stressed the idea of active neutrality, but now they're talking about European or regional solidarity. And I think that neutrality there is going to go. So that really leaves Ireland and Austria as the only European neutrals. And I say that not because they're white fellas, but because I think they're the ones that are the only ones Australia at the moment can even think about. But I think the lessons are pretty important. I won't say any more now because time's finishing, except that I want to say that the question of armed neutrality, and especially in a country so deeply marked culturally as well as politically and economically by its insertion in global systems which are properly called imperialist, but I don't mean that in a reductive way. I just think it's extremely complicated now. Goes together with our inability to imagine anything other than an essentially militarized foreign policy. I'm sure the other speakers will address some parts of this. And I was very pleased to see that Sam Roggeveen in his new book referred to the work of Andrew Mack, who is certainly an old friend of some of us here, and particularly Alison and myself. And he sadly died a couple of years ago. But he was remarkable in many ways. But one, and I noticed that Roggeveen had picked up on this, although he doesn't really do a lot with it, with the idea of non-confrontational defence. For Andrew, that was looking at what could be done in the European Cold War context to have robust defence, particularly one which meets the criteria of neutrality in legal terms, but does not lead you either armed to the teeth or making errors of judgment which end up by having, despite your best intentions, a provocational consequence. And that grew out of earlier work by Andrew in a remarkable book called War Without Weapons, Non-Violence in National Defence. And that's up on the web, thanks to Brian Martin. And I'd urge people to look at it, because what it raises is the other side of what, or one other side of what David Martin was talking about, and to which he was very sympathetic. He was, in certain respects, a very strong realist about you need to think about the military quite seriously and not in a Pollyannaish sort of way. But equally, he was very sympathetic to one aspect of what Mack was talking about, which was the then Swedish idea of total defence. Military strategy and preparations had some role in, for example, preventing or deterring or dissuading a country neighbouring Sweden from attacking it, but also the Swedish policy of total defence, which would have been mobilisation of the population, not just in a civil home guard, but in a planned idea that the civilian population would render the country effectively unusable through planned, sensible, non-violent preparations as a form of defence. I'll finish there for the moment and just urge people to look at that. And I commend the IPAN document as beginning this really important discussion. Thanks very much, Shirley.
Thank you, Richard. It certainly was quite an important presentation, and it's I think it sets a platform, a springboard for continuing discussion with you, Richard, and right across with the public. So thanks again. And the next speaker is Kathryn Kelly. Kathryn is also a member of IPAN. She's a former registered nurse and Commonwealth public servant. She became an activist during the Vietnam War, and over the last 20 years has been a political climate and social justice activist. She's a member of Move Beyond Coal, ACT, of IPAN's National Coordinating Committee, and was a founder and until recently co-convener of the Alliance Against Political Prosecutions. Kathy's been published in Pearls and Irritations on the topic of neutrality. Welcome, Kathryn.
Thanks, Shirley, and thanks, Richard, also for that very comprehensive outline of neutrality. I'd first like to acknowledge the First Nations people of this land and pay respects to their elders, past and present, and also to their continuing culture. I acknowledge that this land was never ceded. I think most, if not all of us, would agree that climate change and nuclear war are the greatest threats to people and the planet today. I won't go into them now, but we'll talk about IPAN's alternative vision for the defence of Australia and how we get there. I've used quite a few resources as background for this talk. One is Hugh White's book, How to Defend Australia. A lot of the information there on developing strategy and identifying military equipment needs is extremely valuable. And Sam Roggeveen has been talked about earlier, his book, The Echidna Strategy. Emma Shortis's Our Exceptional Friend, Clinton Fernandez, Sub-Imperial Power, and Jeff Raby's China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the New Global Order are also useful background. We should note that, as Emma Shortis says, Australia hasn't had to be dragged into any of the military conflicts we have gone into with the US, but has been a very eager participant in the belief that we can then depend on the US for our defence. That strategy has always been massively flawed. Firstly, would it be possible to defend Australia against any aggressor? Hugh White discusses the critical issue of how we should determine our strategic interests. He and others, such as David Martin in his book Armed Neutrality for Australia, as Richard has outlined, and Sam Roggeveen, are of the view that our geostrategic position in the world gives us a great advantage. We can defend a continent given the right strategy and equipment. The distance an aggressor would have to travel while protecting supply lines makes it much harder to invade Australia. So our primary needs are what they call maritime denial, defence of our coastal waters, airspace, wide surveillance and the associated appropriate vessels, aircraft and equipment, and supply lines. White details some of the appalling strategic and procurement decisions of recent years, which should be avoided in future. Now, there are two vital questions related to an independent defence force for Australia. How, or will we need to, defend Australia against China? And how do we defend ourselves against US actions? The first answer to both the questions must be to use and enhance our diplomatic skills and resources, not only for relations with these two great powers, but also to improve our relations with all countries, particularly those in the Asia Pacific, and also particularly Indonesia. Firstly, how to defend against China. Some may think that this is the wrong question, and I would agree that China doesn't pose the greatest threat to us at the moment, but we need to be aware that things could change in the future and be prepared for all possibilities. China's military expenditure, although it has grown a lot over the last decade, is much less than the US's. As Jeff Raby points out, they also have major near neighbour and internal security concerns. Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, natural disasters and the fear of social unrest, as well as long borders with 14 countries. They also have a major reliance on oil imports, which is a huge disadvantage for waging war, as it is also for Australia. The Belt and Road Initiative, most agree, does not indicate an intention to invade any country. There are varying opinions on whether the US will fight a war with China over Taiwan. Both White and Roggeveen say that the US doesn't want a war with China since its core interests, the safety of America itself, are not threatened in Asia. Bevan says that America, under both Trump and Biden, has failed to make the massive investments in military power needed to check China's rise. But he also acknowledges there is an immense US military infrastructure in Asia, a military industrial complex designed to service it, grateful allies who benefit from America's presence, and an overwhelming preference among US policy elites for existing arrangements. America's place in Asia is maintained far more by internal political and bureaucratic, and I would add corporate logic, than by a sound assessment of the threats to US security. He quotes Obama saying, "The US is like a giant ocean liner, and it takes a massive effort to turn it around." So assessments that the US's core interests are not threatened and no one will invade America will not necessarily determine whether the US will end up fighting a war with China over Taiwan. Now to the second and more critical question for us. How do we defend ourselves from the US's actions? Our greatest danger is being a deputy sheriff to the US and being a deputy which eggs the US on. AUKUS was Morrison's idea, which Labor took only 24 hours to agree to. So a lot of consideration went into that, we can see. We could be a soft first target if any skirmishes start in the South China Sea. If we want to disentangle ourselves from the US, what should be our starting point? Any sign of real opposition to Australia's close military engagement with the US will be met with strong pushback from them and from the Albanese government as well. So firstly, we need to build a mass movement opposing the nuclear submarines, our military presence in the South China Sea, and the hosting of US nuclear submarines and B-52s. The AUKUS nuclear submarines are a provocative acquisition which is designed to take the war up to China. That is exactly the opposite of what we need to be doing. As Bevan says, if we escalate, we lose. That should have been obvious to everybody. I don't think we need to talk too much about the alliance or ANZUS at this stage, particularly as most Australians still see the alliance as a good thing. We should emphasise that we want to be friends with America, but good friends should be able to tell each other firmly when they're doing the wrong thing. Discussion of the alliance can come later. ANZUS actually means very little. It's all in the Australian military mind that it includes any real commitments by or towards Australia. And we should publicise the fact that staying neutral in any conflict between the US and China is supported by 51% of Australians and promote the idea of armed neutrality for Australia. Switzerland is the best model for successful armed neutrality and the country with the longest experience of it since 1815. I won't go into that anymore as Richard has covered that very well. Of course, ultimately, to be neutral, we'll need to give termination notices for the Force Posture Agreement and the hosting of Pine Gap, Northwest Cape and any other US bases. But this won't happen overnight. If we can stop the nuclear subs and our Navy and Air Force's deployment in the South China Sea, that would be a great start.
Has admitted that.
Secondly, the campaign should also be against the government's excessive secrecy, lack of oversight of the intelligence agencies, and revolving doors between government and arms manufacturers. We should demand that the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security has broader parliamentary membership. At the moment, it has only Labor and Coalition members, and oversight of the work of the intelligence agencies is beyond the powers of that committee. Clinton Fernandez outlines the problem with the committee in his book, Sub-Imperial Power, Australia in the International Arena. On the revolving doors problem, the Confronting State Capture booklet, published by Australian Democracy Network, outlines that problem well, and you can find that online. We should demand broader sources of defence advice for a more holistic defence strategy, not just hear the US Defence Department or the Australian Strategic Policy Institute voices. Defence of democracy itself and its institutions is also important in this campaign. A free press, combating disinformation, and opposing a slide to authoritarianism is important. To conclude, as David Martin says, the arena in which armed neutrality must be won is Parliament. Hopefully, after the next federal election, we'll have a government with Greens and progressive independents with the balance of power. That would present the best chance of seeing fundamental changes and less chance of undue influence from the US or CIA in our move to an genuinely independent Australia. Australia could be a very important contributor to peace in the world if it took an independent stance. And I'd love to see that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. That was a very good presentation. I just want to remind people, if you're cloned as Bevan Ramsden, your name is Bevan Ramsden and you're not Bevan, you can change your name by clicking the 3 dots at the top of the picture on your screen. And that's where you can change. I think there's about 6 people who are still going under the name of Bevan Ramsden. So our final speaker is Alison Broinowski. Alison is a member of the Board of Directors of World Beyond War and of Australians for War Powers Reform. She was an Australian diplomat until 1996. She has written or edited 14 books and many articles on Australia's interference with Asia, with the United Nations and the world. Her PhD in Asian Studies is from ANU, and she has taught and researched there at Macquarie University and at the University of Wollongong. Alison is a fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. She lives in Sydney with her husband, Richard Broinowski. So welcome, Alison.
Thank you, Shirley. And thank you, everybody, particularly Bevan and all of IPAN for this initiative. It really is an important move, a courageous move for any Australian organisation to take, and it comes at just the right time. I'm speaking from the land of the Eora people of the Gadigal Nation, whose presence I acknowledge. And unfortunately, that leads me to my first point. We've heard a lot in recent times about sovereignty. We're hearing, as we move towards the referendum on the voice, about Indigenous sovereignty, which has never been extinguished and exists to this day. And yet, at the very same time, Australian governments are surrendering our sovereignty, any part of it that remains or ever existed, actually, from the very beginning of colonial occupation and federation. So we've got a kind of contradiction going on here about sovereignty. I won't go on tonight about sovereignty except to say that it is a fundamental problem behind what we're talking about, the concept of armed neutrality for Australia, because for as long as Australia can't claim its own sovereignty as a nation, as a unified nation, one that acknowledges both First Nations people and everybody else who is here now, it is not possible for us to talk about being neutral. Sovereignty implies neutrality. It doesn't imply alliance. And yet Australia has been an allied country ever from the start, never anything else. That was how Australia, settled Australia, was founded, and that is how it remains to this day. And what we're up against is not only that fact, but that mindset among the people, because the kinds of things that we're talking about tonight are not going to happen probably in my lifetime, because people, the great majority of Australians out there, won't get it. Now, at that point, let me go back to where the idea of armed neutrality for Australia actually started. Richard's been talking particularly about David Martin, and he was an important contributor to it. But before that, we had the very important work by John Burton, who in 1954 published his book, The Alternative, which I recommend. Go and dig it out of your library. And it was the first book that John Burton wrote. John Burton was appointed by Evatt as head of foreign affairs at a very young age. And he was a far-seeing idealist about the possibility of Australia relating to the countries in our region much better than we had ever done up to then. And what he saw as important was to get rid of the alliances to what used to be called great foreign powers and relate much more closely to our neighbours in the region and set up ways of dealing with them that suited our interests and theirs. So John Burton's The Alternative actually proposed non-alignment for Australia. He tried very hard to get Australia into the groups that were then being formed, the non-aligned, which led to the non-aligned movement. He went to the Bandung Conference, which led to that. He was present as an Australian representative at meetings convened by India and Indonesia. And his groundwork on that, although it was immediately dismissed by liberal governments which succeeded the Labour government that he was working for at the time, his work remains an important influence. It influenced his successor, Max Teichmann, who's been mentioned briefly tonight. Max, in Melbourne, wrote innumerable pamphlets and books in the 60s and 70s about the proposition of non-alignment for Australia, non-alignment or armed neutrality. And he discussed both, and he went into the pluses and minuses, the advantages, disadvantages, and the obstacles in the way of both of those things happening. Max was convinced that people of goodwill and sense would understand the point. A lot of the time he was writing during or just after the Vietnam War, at a time when many Australians wanted things to be run differently. And he could see that there was an opportunity here for people to require more responsibility than they had been seeing from their governments. He later in the 70s, I think he began to realize what he was up against, that we were back thinking in the past. Nobody wanted any more discussion of that sort of stuff. And he didn't give up on it, but certainly David Martin, as Richard has said, picked up the thread and in 1984 wrote the book that we've been talking about, Armed Neutrality for Australia, in which he went into much more detail about sorts of obstacles that Australia would have to face, particularly the political ones, in getting this thing to happen, the options that existed, the models, some of which in other countries have been mentioned this evening, and how Australia needed to broaden its vision away from our Anglo allies and realize what other countries could do if they wanted to pursue such an option. He recommended Sweden, which of course just this year has ceased to be non-aligned. So there are all kinds of moves going on. Interestingly, then, of course, after a gap of 20 years, we get Malcolm Fraser. Malcolm Fraser, after a career as Army Minister and Prime Minister, as a Cold War warrior, if you like, by 1984 reverses his view completely and writes Dangerous Allies, in which he argues that the greatest danger facing Australia is not from any of the usual suspects, but from the alliance with the United States itself, which exposes Australia to being a proxy target for any enemy of the United States. It exposes Australia to being involved in any war that the United States decides to wage, and it leaves Australia with no sovereignty over its own foreign affairs and defence at all. And Fraser, I must say, redeemed himself in the opinion of many Australians by writing that book. And it deserves rereading in the current context. Then, of course, we have Sam Roggeveen, his latest, which Richard has commandeered and been reading and writing about, and I haven't been able to read it yet, but I will. I must say, going to listen to Sam the other night and reading other articles about him, about what he has said, I have a feeling that he's being rather careful about not stepping beyond the boundaries of the Lowy Institute. And I'm not at all sure that he takes his argument as far as some people would like towards non-alignment or unarmed neutrality for Australia. That doesn't mean it doesn't mean it won't happen, but it certainly does show us that it's very much a step-by-step process. And the first steps are really only just being taken now. Why are we taking them now? Because the time has come to revive what these people from the past, John Burton, Max Teichmann, David Martin, Malcolm Fraser, were saying. It was time for them, it's time for us. And that's why I commend IPAN for having taken this initiative, realized that this is the time, because for the first time now, we are actually confronting the consequence of being an ally. The consequence is that we are threatened by the potential enemy of our ally. And the potential for Australia to become a proxy target in a war between China and the United States looms over us. Not only that, but we are provoking it by AUKUS and all the military build-up that involves in the north of Australia and elsewhere. Provoking it because it is clearly all of that directed against China, and the Chinese completely understand that and recognize it. And if push came to shove over the South China Sea or over Taiwan or whatever, some accident or some contrived false flag event, whatever took place, Australia could be the proxy target in such a war. If China didn't want to take the risk of attacking the United States, Australia would be the one. Now that is why this is the right moment for us to be considering all of these things. And the more the message that Bevan and his colleagues in IPAN have devised gets out to the people, and the more people understand this, the more chance we have of heading off this potentially disastrous and catastrophic outcome in our region. Why here? Because the United States doesn't have a dog in the fight in Asia. The United States can always retreat to wherever it wants to go. leaving us and its few allies, Japan, Korea, to be the proxies in such a war, just as Ukraine is its proxy against Russia. And there are people in the United States who are unscrupulous enough to actually have that in mind, encouraged by many in Australia, like people in Aspie, like people, quite frankly, in both of our major parties, who cannot get away from the age-old rhetoric that we've been waltzing together, going all the way, joined at the hip, interoperable, interchangeable, indistinguishable from the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. That was a pretty powerful presentation, as usual. Look, I know some people have to leave at 7 o'clock, so we'll really need to be very quick. But before we go on to the next item, next session, which is questions, I'd just like to, and Alison has done that already. She acknowledged the working group and Bevan, but I do want to mention the names of the working group, the members of the working group who've been working on this for a long time, and they are Derek, Lois, Bevan, Ross, David, Kathryn, and Stephen. And there are others who put a lot of thought, work, and time into this vision for the independent and peaceful Australia. So many thanks to that, to the working group, the collective. So the next part of the Zoom meeting will be 15 minutes of questions and answers to speakers, obviously, and they'll be followed by 20 minutes comments from participants. And then finally, we'll be, after the comments, we'll invite the participants to vote on IPAN's in-principle vision statement for a sovereign self-defence policy. So we'll start with the Q&As first. People will have to put up their, either questions can be put verbally by clicking the yellow hand icon at the bottom of your picture, or they can be typed into the chat. So have we got people putting up their hand? Questions? Julie, Julie, you've got a question to ask?
I'm sorry, I was muted. I was just saying goodbye. I'd love to stay, but I do have this meeting.
Okay, well, this is being recorded. Thanks, Julie. Colin has got his hand up.
I just wanted to ask, do you think that inscription should be ruled out in the vision statement? I noticed that the last sentence of that vision statement is ambiguous, really, and it could be read as supporting the idea of compulsory military service or compulsory home defence service
Okay,
in
thanks.
the event of war. And I just wanted to ask that.
Yeah, no. Thanks, Colin. Bevan wants to answer, but could I just also say that there's, after the questions, there is 20 minutes for statements from participants, and all that, statement and comments, suggestions, and all those suggestions and comments will be taken up, discussed, and considered by the working group, just to clarify things. So, Bevan, go ahead.
Colin, I think that's a good one you have raised, and we'll take that back to our working group to incorporate an appropriate comment in. I'm for one, I fought against conscription in the 1970s, and I'm totally opposed to force anyone to be involved in military service. And I would like to see that included in the vision statement, as you have said. We don't need conscription, no.
Okay, are there any others on screen who want to make have a verbal question or want to ask a question verbally? So, Kay, I see Kay's putting her hand. Kay, the people just at the bottom of your picture, there is the reactions icon. If you click that reaction icons and put up your hand that way, so it'll come up on the screen. So, Kay, I'll go. Kay's got her hand up, but it's not on the screen. So Bob, is that okay? We'll ask Kay first. Kay could ask a question and then Bob after that.
Well, I am a newly rejoined member of the Labor Party. We won't say which party, which branch, but we are going to stick our heads out and having our first meeting tomorrow about how we can work within the Labor Party to try and get the strategies that you're talking about up and going, and to get people moved from the lethargic situations that they sit in to something that's more aligned with what you're trying to achieve. So you need to wish us all the best.
Okay, so that's a comment?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We'll have comments.
Could I say something on that, Shirley?
Yep, of course.
I'd welcome any activity around AUKUS and towards this strategy, but I think it's very important to consider supporting progressive independents who might have the balance of power, because I'm just afraid that the Labor Party is never going to stand up to the US.
Yeah, that's our fear. Yes. But anyway, look, I have to go to another.
Thank you, Kay. So Bob's got his. Thank you, Kay. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Bob, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I have to go too. But just before that, does IPAN plan to call out those who are the chief advocates for the current policy? Because it's a bit unclear where the institutions and the individuals are in the revolving door and are pushing forward on our continuation of the existing power relations with the US, etc. I mean, this is an adversarial situation, but IPAN seems to be working in that way in a sort of vacuum of not saying who the other side are. And so I wonder if you're going to play any part in that. The other thing is NATO in the Pacific. This is clearly an intrusion into our region, and the war games of 13 countries from this region recently, are they part of this picture as well? Are they going to figure in this discussion? Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Who'd like to answer that question? Bevan or Kathy or Richard?
I'll just say something about the last part, if I may, and then I'll have to pop off. Bob, I think you're absolutely right. I think NATO in the Pacific, what I would actually call now what the US is planning in terms of global NATO, is a really important movement. The idea of our Prime Minister going to a NATO summit is, and particularly looking around, as if this is something wonderful, is kind of humiliating, I think, for Australia. And I think we have to recognise that the United States has not been passive. They have been working very hard to restructure alliances, both the alliances in the Pacific, trying to get Japan and Australia and South Korea working together, the alliances with the Pacific in a different way of getting France and Australia to have a bilateral military relationship, Japan and Australia, Australia and India. This is really, the Americans are really pushing this very hard. So I think you're quite right to raise it. The war games are really very serious now. And I think that that mantra of interoperability, which Alison quite rightly emphasised, it's a very deep, it goes right into the heart of our defence planning now. So I think you're quite right. And I think the other side to remember from the B-52s, again, as Alison and Kathryn said, is this takes us to a new nuclear posture. We've had the bases for a long time. Northwest Cape providing communications assistance, Pine Gap providing a wide range of signals intelligence and early warning and missile defences, effectively critical information for nuclear targeting. But now we're going much further and providing bases for bombers which will either be nuclear armed or they'll be conventionally armed with really quite horrific weapons. And the Chinese, as Alison and Kathryn have emphasised, will have to assume that we have made a pretty fundamental existential decision, and they will respond accordingly. So that's part of the big change. I'm sorry, but I've got to go, but thank you very much, everything. Take care, people. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you.
Bye.
Can I just before I go say in conclusion too that I'm not in a position to vote quite yet. I'll have to go back and read Neutrality for Australia and the other books that have been recommended, which don't seem to be available in Victoria's library system, which is an unfortunate oversight. Maybe we could do something about getting them back into the system so people can actually get them and read them. Thanks. See you soon, everybody.
Bye, Bob. Thank you.
Bye.
Kathy's next.
Yes, I just wanted to say something about the revolving door. As I mentioned, this book, Confronting the State Capture, is very good about that. And we do have a working group, an IPAN working group addressing this. We are lobbying some politicians to get legislation against, to stop that revolving door so that people can't just go from the high levels of government, ministers, or even public servants to armaments companies, and the reverse of people from armaments companies having influence in contract procurement issues and things like that. So yes, we're working on that, and if people would like to be involved in that, they can join the working group, which is on the IPAN website.
Thank you, Kathy. Margie, do you unmute yourself?
Yeah, so I just wanted to echo what somebody else said about the Labor Party. I think that, the young people that I work with have no faith whatsoever in the Labor Party. And I've been amazed by how many members of the peace movement of this sort of old cohort are still members of the Labor Party. And I'd like $5 for every person who said, oh, we thought that when this Labor Party would get in, everything would be different. And I have to say that anybody who says that is an idiot, because it's all been pushing in this direction for the last 30 years. And anybody who's been watching it pushing in this direction, such as I have, is seen it pushing in that direction. So my concern is that I think that you all, or many of you, conceptualize things with an idea that somehow a better Labor Party is going to emerge. And I think this is wrong. And I think you need to somehow reconceptualize without that as a central sort of facet to the thinking. I don't know how you do that, but I think it's a cultural change because I know people are very committed to the left as an idea. But I think culturally, the young people that I work have got no interest in working with anything in that sphere. So how you communicate that has to communicate to those people, the young people who are taking action. And as somebody said earlier, we have to build a mass movement. All of these, I'm echoing everything people have said already, but I'm just trying to bring it together in a particular with a particular sharp focus.
Thank you, Mikey. It's an important contribution, and it's a discussion that's probably happening right across the country, and definitely is within IPAN and many other progressive organisations. I've also got a question from Justin Tutty. So Richard has left the meeting, but perhaps Alison could answer. How do we reconcile the tensions between non-alignment and West Papuan independence? It's a good question.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Justin. In fact, West Papua is one of our big black holes. It's one of our big neglected issues. And it's something on which, if we had a better Labor Party, as Margie has just described, if we had a proper government taking account of the events in West Papua, then we could lead the world on this. In fact, I'll tell you who does, in one way, in her own way, is Jennifer Robinson, who is their legal advocate and has been pushing the West Papua issue for a very long time. But Australia, for the same reasons that go right back to Whitlam, is locked in with staying on side with Indonesia. And if we want, no government that I know about is going to want to stir up the kind of reaction from Indonesia that pushing for West Papuan sovereignty would involve. We aren't even doing anything about Myanmar, for God's sake. You know, we sit back, we let these horrible things go on. And quite frankly, to come back to today's topic, if we were a non-aligned country, we would be much more capable of doing the sorts of things that we ought to be doing, because we wouldn't be looking over our shoulder all the time at what the Americans might say. And that's what we do all the time, all the time. Think about what the Americans think. And if we know what they think, oh, then that's what we think. That's why Australia is so ineffective now in most multilateral organizations and in the United Nations, because they don't need us. They know what the Americans think. Why do they want to listen to Australia?
Thank you, Alison. Are there any other questions? If not, we can then proceed. I mean, there's already statements and comments have been made. So are there any further comments people want to make? Warren's got his hand up.
Yeah, I've got a general question, and it concerns the military forces in the country. There are a number of avenues that have been used by the military to express concerns from time to time. One of them is, of course, through Jackie Lambry. She's got connections there that she brings to the attention of Parliament and the community. But there's also the Australian Defence Association, which quite sometimes makes public some of the concerns, particularly of the officer corps of the military. So I'm just wondering whether the people that are organising lobbying for different and putting our point of view to different areas have considered approaching those people, because I'm sure, as well as us, there are more patriots in the army as well, who, and I'm talking about genuine patriots who put Australia before the interests of the US and its military-industrial complex, if you like.
Who would like to answer that? Alison or Bevan? Kathy?
I'd like to just say I agree. I think there's certainly very good suggestions, Warren, and we should look into that, particularly in the working group that we're doing there. At the moment, we've talked to David Pocock's advisor, and he's also indicated that there's other people who are interested in this issue of the revolving doors. But there's other lobbying, obviously, rather than just on that issue. So, yeah, thanks for that.
Anyone else wants to make up? Bevan or Alison? No. Margie, you've got it. So after Margie, maybe people want to make comments or suggestions. Maybe we should just go into that after Margie's question. I presume it's a question, Margie.
Yeah, it's about you think there is a consensus on? There seems to me to be some sort of consensus emerging amongst the ADF scholars that Australia is a long way away from everywhere, and that there's no need for much of a defence force. Would you say that's true? There's an emerging scholar, Bevan, saying no. You know, the Sam Rochelain sort of idea. You know, there's no consensus emerging.
Kathy's got her hand up, and as well.
Yes, I think Albert Palazzo, who was the director of the Army Research Centre, sort of gives the indication that that's probably not the case, that the Army is still, you know, they're probably still supporting the US. He's sort of said he's been a bit of a lone voice. So unfortunately, I don't think so.
Okay. Bevan, did you want to make any further comments?
No, well, not really. What Warren says, yes, we should always be looking for allies, and there would be patriotic people thinking that way, but in the army, they're so, well, if they're in the army now or in the ADF now, they have great difficulty speaking up or saying anything. When they retire, they do come to the surface sometimes and speak up. We should always be looking for allies there, and politicians like Lambie, if it's possible to lobby and talk there, we should always. But I think, Margie, that there isn't really, from what Al Palazzo has said, any movement away from conventional defence. He's argued for neutrality too in his writings. Hugh White is probably the one defence analyst who has put forward some of these ideas, but he doesn't get much traction around in Canberra, I don't think. He's getting himself rather isolated. But the movement is more widespread. If I can just say one thing, the Lowy Institute did a survey about what Australian people think if there was a war between US and China. And we have to remember this one, it's very important. 56% of Australians said they preferred neutrality for Australia if a war broke out between US and China. Now, 67% of young people took that position, and an amazing 73% of Australian women took the position that we should remain neutral if there was a war broke out between the US and China. That's a base that we must build on.
Great. Thank you, Bevan. So are there any comments on the actual vision statement? People like to comment, have proposals or suggestions? Maybe you could put your hand up. No? Are people ready to vote on this statement? There's obviously agreement on it. Just to let you know that the statement is a general framework for an alternative sovereign self-defence policy, obviously. But we all our discussion here has been recorded, and we have the comments from the chat, which will be considered by the working group. If you're interested in joining the working group, please leave your contact details either in the chat or send us an email. Our next meeting, the next meeting of the working group, is next Thursday. I think it's the 4th or 5th of October. Anyway, it's next Thursday, and people are really welcome to come for further discussion and the comments that have arisen out of this meeting and the contributions from the 4 great speakers. So I think from now on, if people are happy, we can take an in principle, we can vote on an in principle agreement on the vision statement, and this vision statement will then be taken to an IPAN members AGM meeting, which will be held probably later this year, which will become a formal, I guess, policy statement of IPAN. This the vision for sovereign self-defence is a work in progress. So it's the vision statement is only, as I said, it's only a framework. It's a general framework which we will continue to work on and develop with input from others as well. So do people want to look at it again on the screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah? Would you like for someone to read it out? Or you're happy just to read it yourselves? Okay. Right. Okay. So the motion is, do you support in principle this IPAN vision statement? And all those in favour, could you raise your hand by That's by clicking if you've got the icon at the bottom of your screen. Great. So are there any, it looks like the majority have voted yes. Is there anyone who's opposed to the statement? Could you put those who are in favour, could you put your hands down?
Shirley, can I just say for those people who have video stopped, we may not be able to see their vote if they're not using the thumbs up.
Okay,
So
those who are, can we do this again? I've got 4 who've got their hands up, and I presume from their names, I presume that they support the statement. Is that right? Can all those who support the statement put your hands down? Patrick, could you put your hand down, and also Alison? We assume that Alison supports it. Those who are opposed to this. Okay, there's a person, Margaret Walters. Okay, Margaret? No. Okay, we've got the majority, obviously. Now the statement will be taken to IPAN AGM, where it will be put for IPAN members to adopt as a policy, as a working document, as the initial framework for a vision. So people are happy with that? Okay. Anyone else interested in joining the working group? Can you type your contact details into the into the chat, or send us an email? And we'll obviously keep everyone who's registered for this email will be kept informed, and we will continue to be in contact with you. So thank you all for coming. It's been a terrific evening, and let's continue building the movement.
Shirley, can I just mention the AGM is on Sunday, the 12th of November at 2:30 p.m.
Okay, thank you.
Australian daylight savings time.
So members, this is for members of IPAN. You'll be able to vote on this motion. Thank you and good night. Thank you for being patient with us.
Thank you for those organised.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Bye. Bye.